In the history of aerial warfare, there is an unwritten rule. Speed is life. Armor is just dead weight. Engineers spent decades shaving ounces off airframes, building fighters out of thin aluminum and canvas, trading protection for agility. But in 1941, an eccentric Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli looked at the rulebook of aviation design, lit a match, and burned it to the ground. He didn't build a fighter. He built a monster. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first arrived in England, the British pilots gathered around it in stunned silence. It stood on its landing gear like a prehistoric beast. It was twice the weight of a Spitfire. It was wider than a Hurricane. One RAF pilot famously walked around the massive fuselage, tapped the metal skin, and asked, "Where's the rest of the gymnasium hidden?" They laughed at it. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, or perhaps because it looked like a flying milk bottle. They said it would never dogfight. They said it drops like a brick. But they were wrong. Because when the flak started bursting and the 20mm cannon started shredding aluminum, the laughter stopped. While other fighters disintegrated under fire, the Thunderbolt simply absorbed the punishment and kept flying. It came home with cylinders blown off. It came home with wings shredded to ribbons. It came home after colliding with chimneys, trees, and telephone poles. This is not just the story of a plane. This is the story of the toughest machine ever to grace the sky. The plane that pilots swore had a soul because it refused to let them die. This is the legend of the unkillable Jug. To understand why this machine was indestructible, we have to look inside the mind of its creator. Alexander Kartveli didn't start by designing a fuselage. He started with a problem. The problem was altitude. The U.S. Army Air Corps wanted a fighter that could escort bombers high in the stratosphere. To do that, you need air. Lots of it. At 30,000 feet, the air is too thin for a standard piston engine to breathe. You need a turbocharger, a massive air pump that forces oxygen into the engine. Most designers tried to strap the turbocharger to the engine, making the nose heavy and awkward. Kartveli did something radical. He placed the massive turbocharger all the way in the back of the fuselage, behind the cockpit. This decision dictated everything. To connect the engine in the front to the turbocharger in the back, Kartveli had to run massive ducting pipes along the belly of the plane. These pipes were huge. They forced the fuselage to be deep, wide, and heavy. Essentially, the P-47 was just a giant flying lung wrapped in metal. But this accidental bulk became its greatest shield. Those pipes running underneath the cockpit meant that if a pilot was attacked from below by ground fire or an enemy fighter climbing up, the bullets had to pass through layers of steel ducting, intercoolers, and machinery before they could even reach the pilot's feet. The plane was built around its own armor. And then there was the heart of the beast, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. 2,000 horsepower, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows. This engine is the single most important reason why P-47 pilots survived while P-51 pilots died. The Mustang used a liquid-cooled engine, the Merlin. Liquid-cooled engines are like delicate watches. They rely on a complex network of radiators and hoses to keep coolant flowing. If a single stray bullet, just one .30 caliber round, nicks a coolant hose, the liquid drains out. Within minutes, the engine overheats, seizes up, and the plane falls out of the sky. The Mustang was a glass cannon. The P-47's radial engine was different. It was air-cooled. No radiators, no fragile hoses. It was essentially a massive block of steel slamming through the air. You could shoot a hole through a cylinder. You could blow an entire cylinder head off. You could sever the oil lines. The R-2800 didn't care. It would cough, it would spit oil, it would shake the pilot's teeth out, but it would keep turning. It would generate enough power to drag the heavy airframe back across the English Channel. There are documented cases of P-47s returning to base with 3 cylinders completely destroyed, the engine block cracked, and the propeller running on sheer momentum and hatred. But engineering theory is one thing, reality is another. The true test of the Jug's durability happened on June 26, 1943. This is the story of Robert S. Johnson and the day he became a legend. Johnson was flying a mission over France. It was a chaotic dogfight. He had just shot down a Focke-Wulf 190 when disaster struck. A 20mm cannon shell from another German fighter slammed into his cockpit. The explosion was deafening. It shattered his canopy, sprayed hydraulic fluid into his eyes, and jammed his canopy shut. He was trapped. Blind, burned, and struggling to breathe, Johnson put his plane into a spin, hoping to play dead. The German fighters circled, watched him fall, and assumed the kill. Johnson leveled out at low altitude, trying to limp back to England. The engine was damaged, but running. But he wasn't alone. As he leveled off, he saw a shadow slide into position behind him. It was a Focke-Wulf 190, flown by a German ace named Egon Meyer. Myers saw the smoking P-47 and decided to finish the job. He pulled up behind Johnson, perfectly positioned at the 6 o'clock. This should have been an execution. Meyer opened fire. Machine gun bullets raked the P-47 from tail to nose. Johnson huddled behind his armor plate, a heavy slab of steel directly behind the pilot's seat. He could hear the bullets hammering against the steel like hail on a tin roof. Clang, clang, clang. The P-47 shuddered, but it didn't explode. The self-sealing fuel tanks absorbed the rounds. The rugged airframe held together. Meyer was confused. He adjusted his aim and fired his 20mm cannons. Boom, boom, boom. Cannon shells exploded against the fuselage. They blew huge holes in the rudder. They tore chunks off the wings. Johnson lost control of his rudder pedals. The hydraulic system was gone. The flaps were gone. Any other plane, a Mustang, a Spitfire, a Lightning, would have been a fireball by now. But the Jug kept flying. Johnson, realizing he couldn't escape, just kept the nose pointed toward England. Meyer ran out of cannon ammunition. He flew up alongside Johnson, wingtip to wingtip. Johnson looked over. He saw the German pilot staring at him. He could see the look of absolute disbelief on Meyer's face. The German looked at the shredded tail, the holes in the fuselage, the smoking engine, and then looked at Johnson. Meyer shook his head. He had hit this plane with everything he had.
It defied the laws of physics. It defied the laws of combat. Out of ammunition, and perhaps out of respect for the stubborn machine, Meyer rocked his wings in a salute and peeled away. Johnson managed to belly-land the wreck at an RAF base in Manston. When he climbed out, the ground crew couldn't believe he was alive. They counted the holes. There were 21 20-millimeter cannon shell impacts. There were over 200 machine gun holes. One propeller blade was half gone. The rudder was hanging by a thread. Johnson looked at his crew chief and said, "I think she needs a little work." That day, the legend of the flying bathtub was cemented forever. You could hit a P-47, but you couldn't kill it.
Why did it survive? It wasn't magic, it was mass. The structural engineering of the Thunderbolt was closer to a bridge than an airplane. Take the wings, for example. Most fighters used 2, maybe 3 main spars, the metal beams that give the wing its strength. The P-47 used 4 massive, heavy-duty spars. This meant you could literally saw through half the wing with gunfire, and the remaining spars would still hold the wing to the fuselage. There are photos of P-47s landing with entire wingtips sheared off after clipping trees during low-level strafing runs. Then there was the cockpit. Kartveli designed it as a survival capsule. The pilot sat high, giving excellent visibility, but he was surrounded by protection. The windshield was bulletproof glass, an 1.5 inches thick. Behind the seat was a heavy armor plate that could stop a .5 caliber round at close range. Beneath the cockpit, the airframe keel was reinforced to protect the pilot in a belly landing. While landing a P-51 without wheels was a death sentence, because the radiator scoop would dig in and flip the plane. The P-47's smooth, heavy belly allowed it to slide along the ground like a sled. Pilots walked away from crashes that would have buried them in any other aircraft. And we cannot forget the fuel tanks. Fire is the pilot's greatest fear. The P-47 was equipped with advanced self-sealing tanks. When a bullet pierced the tank, the rubber lining would react with the leaking fuel, swelling up instantly to plug the hole. This technology wasn't unique to the P-47, but the placement was. The tanks were buried deep in the fuselage, shielded by the heavy wing roots and the turbocharger ducting. It was arguably the safest place to carry gasoline in a war zone. This durability created a new tactical doctrine. Late in the war, when the Luftwaffe was swept from the skies, the P-47 found its true calling: ground attack. Flying close to the ground is suicide for fragile planes. Small arms fire, rifles, machine guns from infantry can bring down a liquid-cooled fighter. But the P-47? Pilots treated it like a flying tank. They would dive straight into the teeth of German flak batteries. They would fly so low that they would return to base with branches and telephone wire wrapped around their landing gear. There is a famous story of a pilot in Italy
who flew his P-47 through a brick wall while strafing a factory. Through a brick wall. The plane was dented, scratched, and ugly, but it flew back to base.
By 1944, the P-47 had decimated the Luftwaffe. The sky was clear, but the war wasn't over. The Allies needed to break the German army on the ground. They needed a machine that could carry the payload of a bomber, but fly with the agility of a fighter. The P-47 was reborn as the Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. And for the German soldier on the ground, the silhouette of that elliptical wing became the Grim Reaper. The Jug could carry 2,500 pounds of external ordnance. That is roughly half the bomb load of a B-17 Flying Fortress. Think about that. A single-engine fighter carrying half the destruction of a four-engine heavy bomber. They strapped 500-pound bombs to its wings. They attached clusters of HVAR rockets, high-velocity aircraft rockets, which struck with the force of a destroyer's naval gun. And of course, they still had the 8.50 caliber machine guns in the wings. When a P-47 unleashed everything it had, it could vaporize a heavy tank column in seconds. But ground attack is dangerous. You have to fly low, treetop level. You are within range of everything. 88mm flak, 20mm verbal wind quad cannons, even soldiers with rifles. This is where the P-47's legend truly went from impressive to mythical. Stories of survival became commonplace. There is the documented case of a pilot attacking a German train in France. He flew so low and so aggressively that he didn't just bomb the train, he collided with it. He flew through the explosion of the locomotive. Debris from the train shattered his windshield. The heat blistered the paint on the nose. A piece of the train's smokestack embedded itself in the wing, but the R-2800 engine didn't stop. The pilot flew the plane back to base, landed, and reportedly complained that the soot from the train was hard to see the runway. Another pilot took a direct hit from an 88mm anti-aircraft shell right through the wing. The shell punched a hole big enough for a man to crawl through. It severed the main spar on one side. By all laws of physics, the wing should have snapped off immediately. It didn't. The redundancy built into Kartveli's design held the wing together long enough for the pilot to cross the channel and crash land in England. When engineers examined the wreck, they couldn't explain mathematically how the wing had stayed attached. The Jug simply refused to obey the laws of structural failure. History remembers the P-51 Mustang as the hero of the war. It was sleek, sexy, and had the range to go to Berlin and back. It was the Cadillac of the skies. The P-47 was the dump truck. But ask the men who flew them. There was a famous saying among American pilots in Europe: if you want to have your picture taken, fly a Mustang. if you want to survive, to show the picture to your grandchildren, fly a Thunderbolt. The statistics back this up. The P-47 had one of the lowest loss rates of any American fighter in the war, 0.7 lost per sortie. The Mustang, while superior in range and dogfighting agility, was fragile. A single bullet in the radiator meant a POW camp or a grave. A single bullet in a jug usually meant a funny story at the bar that night. This created a profound emotional bond between pilot and machine. Pilots didn't just respect the jug, they loved it. They trusted it with their lives in a way they didn't trust other aircraft. Francis Gabby Gabreski, the top American ace in Europe, flew the P-47. He utilized its massive diving speed to bounce German fighters. He knew that if he got into trouble, he could simply point the heavy nose at the ground, throttle up, and outdive anything in the sky. The P-47 dropped like a stone that could break the sound barrier in a dive. In fact, the P-47 was so heavy and aerodynamic that it was the first piston fighter to encounter compressibility, the shock waves that form as you approach the speed of sound. While other planes would break apart under these forces, the jug's massive structure held firm. It could dive at over 500 miles per hour, recover, and pull enough G-force to black out the pilot, yet the wings stayed on.
Despite its heroism, the end of the P-47 was swift. When the war ended, the jet age arrived. The Mustang served on in Korea, but the Thunderbolt was deemed too expensive to operate. It drank fuel like a monster, and its complex turbocharger system was a maintenance nightmare in peacetime. Thousands of these magnificent beasts were lined up, stripped of their engines, and melted down into aluminum ingots. The 7-ton milk bottle that had saved thousands of American lives was turned into soda cans and window frames. But its soul didn't die. Decades later, when the U.S. Air Force needed a new dedicated ground attack aircraft, a plane that was slow, heavily armored, and built around a massive gun, designers looked back at the P-47. They built the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. It is the spiritual successor to the Jug. Like its grandfather, it is ugly. Like its grandfather, it is built around a titanium bathtub to protect the pilot. And like its grandfather, it refuses to die. The pilots who fly the A-10 today owe their philosophy of survival to Alexander Kartveli and his flying anvil. In a war of delicate machines and fragile egos, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood apart. It wasn't the prettiest, it wasn't the most agile, but it was the best friend a pilot ever had. It proved that in the brutal arithmetic of war, coming home is the only victory that matters, and no machine in history brought more men home than the Jug. Robert S. Johnson, the man who survived the execution by Egon Mayer, lived to be 78 years old. He lived because on a summer day in 1943,
Alexander Kartveli's engineering refused to let him die. That is the legacy of the Thunderbolt. Not the enemy planes it shot down, but the empty chairs it filled at dinner tables back home. If you enjoyed this story of survival, hit that subscribe button. And tell us in the comments, would you rather fly the agile Mustang or the indestructible Thunderbolt? Check out our video on the A-10 Warthog right here to see the legacy continue. Thanks for watching.